while pop art was loved by the masses and hated by the elites, who thought it was pandering to consumerism, minimalism was hated by the masses and loved by the elites. That might explain why it was the favorite style of sculpture in the plazas in front of office buildings, which often look rather like minimalist sculptures themselves. You see that here in the view of 6th Avenue. We can introduce minimalism by looking at an artist who himself is not actually quite a minimalist. No, Frank Stella is more of a proto-minimalist, at least when it concerns his earliest paintings. Frank Stella emerged on the scene a year out of Princeton, even making it into an important show at MoMA in 1959, called 16 Americans. One thing you can say for Stella is that he sure was savvy. He knew that you carve a place for yourself in the contemporary art world by making art that, in effect, answers other art, that participates in a kind of art dialogue. By answering it, you show respectful deference, on the one hand, deference by taking it seriously, by honoring its innovation. But you also show difference by doing something new, something with a twist that sets your work off from the pack and shows how important you are. It's what the junk sculptors did with abstract expressionism, copying its look, but stripping away its emotion. Stella saw a show of works by Jasper Johns at Leo Castelli Gallery in 1958, and it was those works that he responded to. Stella's work demonstrates, or at least suggests, the absence of the artist, a lesson that he learned by looking at Jasper Johns' flag paintings. The painting you've been looking at is a flag painting too, Die Fahne hoch, German for the flag high, or raise the flag high, painted in 1959. It takes its name from the Horst Wessel song, a Nazi marching song about spilling blood and guts, so it's pretty provocative. Maybe the fact that it looks like a pinstriped suit is provocative too, I don't know. All about corporate power, the kind of things that the public didn't like. But the rest of it is really about theory, about the absence of the artist, like in Jasper Johns' work. Here is how. Take, for example, the stripes, like the stripes in a Johns flag painting. Well, these stripes are 2 inches wide. Why? Because the stretcher is 2 inches thick. Stella liked the effect of a thick stretcher, which he saw in Johns' work. He liked it because it made a painting feel like an object rather than some sort of window into an illusion or some kind of representation. It made the thing into a thing. It revealed its thingness. And what looks like expressive lines between the stripes, are not expressive lines at all. They're actually unpainted canvas, left that way by using a 2-inch wide brush, so wide that he simply had to work to keep it straight, and that totally eliminated any sort of artistic expressive touch. Finally, let's not neglect the composition. It's determined by bisecting each side of the stretcher, dividing it in half, and then using that resulting cross as a generating form. Once set into place by factors like the dimensions of the stretcher, the composition basically generates itself. This is quite a change from the way that painters like, say, Monet had designed a composition before drawing it on the canvas. You know, a composition balancing a tree on one side with a boat on the other. What Donald Judd, the theorist and sculptor, called, quote, relational composition, unquote. This put way too much responsibility for things on the human being, who, as Johns and Rauschenberg had demonstrated, were not creators at all as such, but actually just facilitators for funneling signs from the culture into art. Here's Judd on the old approach, quote, all that art is based on systems built beforehand, a priori systems. They express a certain type of thinking and logic that is pretty much discredited now as a way of finding out what the world is like." Unquote. About his own work, Stella said, quote, "What you see is what you see." Unquote. He meant that there is no inner meaning, no symbol, no designedness. It's just what it is. It's just a system of appearances that results from a set of circumstances. Stella even increased this effect with works like Ouray from 1961, named for a Colorado mining town which had been known in the 19th century for its silver and gold prospecting. This painting is painted with metallic paint so that it reflects the light and shadow of the world. It was a way of showing that it had no inner meaning. Note, too, that this is a cross-shaped canvas, that the composition of a cross determines the shape of the canvas. It's another idea that Stella got from Johns, from flag paintings, where the design of the flag determined the shape of the canvas. Well, now it's on to the minimalists. The minimalists didn't like the term minimalism because they said they weren't reducing anything at all. They were clarifying. They preferred terms like literalism and even primary structures to describe their work. Donald Judd, who had studied philosophy at Columbia, wrote a lot about minimalism. Like Stella, with those thick canvases that made paintings feel like objects, Judd simply described his works not as paintings or sculptures, but as objects in real space. They were what they were, not art, but themselves. That meant that the role of the artist was reduced from being a creator to being a manager. The artist didn't create a plan. She or he only found a system in the world and funneled it into the work. Take, for example, Untitled from 1965. Notice first its lack of a title, because the artist doesn't invent. It's a wall stack of boxes, and that's it. Can you see what's in the boxes? Nothing. They're empty. They have no inner meaning. What kind of surface do they have? Shiny to reflect the world. What determines the spaces between the boxes? The height of a box itself. Sometimes the patterns were more elaborate math equations, but once a sequence was determined by a set of found principles, it basically meant that there was nothing for the artist to do but facilitate the outcome. Of course, this could be empowering too, because it put the artist in the role of manager, like a corporate manager. When Tony Smith made Die in 1962, he simply got on the phone and told a foundry to make a black 6 by 6 by 6 foot cube, 6 feet because it had 6 sides, and was therefore a form that was determined by math, not by invention. In fact, it seems to hover just a little bit on a tiny base, as though it were a Platonic idea, the universal essence of a cube, as it exists everywhere for all time, and therefore nothing that anyone could ever take credit for inventing. He was acting like a corporate executive in a way, rather like Warhol would say he did in his factory. Perhaps the corporate undertones come through in conjuring an image of power, even of death, with the black 6 foot cube suggesting something 6 feet under. So you could say that minimalism not only undermines the authority of the artist, it also attacks the dignity of the viewer. That's not the way the minimalists ever talked about their work. Far from it. They tended to be progressive, liberal, pro-worker. Carl Andre was so politically involved, in fact, that in 1969 he formed the Art Workers Coalition, seeing artists as workers, and mobilized artists against the Vietnam War and against the art establishment, which had remained quiet, complacent about it. Let's look at one of his floor pieces. It's easy to see how this one, Lead piece from 1969 is minimalist. The squares come that way, as squares, so the pattern they form, a larger square, is determined by their shape, and the overall square they make is simply the result of uniform expansion. The lead tiles are flat, so they can't possess any internal meaning. There's not enough room, so they don't have any interior. They're somewhat shiny, so they reflect the light of the world. And when a person steps on them, the scuffs and scratches that they receive show how any marks they have aren't made by the artist, but instead are made by the world. André made a political point, too, here about people stepping on his work. He said that pieces like this one were designed as platforms for the viewer who could come and stand on them. It was, he suggested, a way of raising up and setting apart the common person, even if it wasn't raising them up that very far. But in practice, they don't actually work this way. In the context of a museum, visitors become unsure of themselves. They become shy, afraid of being wrestled to the ground by guards if they as much as set foot on one of André's works. So far from ennobling people like a platform, the works seem to challenge them, to dare them to take that first step. All in all, the works seem, like Tony Smith's die, to diminish the sense of authority and well-being of a visitor. That's certainly the case with Robert Morris's untitled L-beams of 1965. Here, the same L shape appears 3 times, but each time it feels different. One towers over you when you stand by it. Another makes an enclosure, a kind of arch, under a pitched roof. The third is a bench that looks like you could comfortably sit on it. In other words, each relates to your body in a different way, so each feels differently. Yet the 3 forms are identical. Morris's piece calls into question the ability of the viewer's perceptions to see the truth. It's a reminder of the way that we see everything from our own limited perspective, and we are, in effect, trapped in our own minds, locked out from seeing actual truth. Maybe that's why Morris created a poster for his 1974 exhibition at Leo Castelli Gallery that makes him look like a sadomasochist, somebody who on the one hand is a slave to forces bigger than he is, as he was with his art, determined by Platonic ideals and by geometric measures. But on the other hand, it shows him as a bully too, ready to use his art to dominate the viewer and to diminish the viewer's sense of their own authority and power. Without the sadomasochistic overtones, this was, if you remember, the lesson of Duchamp's precision optics, rotary glass plates. How it isn't precise at all. How you can't trust your eyes. The same is true of Dan Flavin's art, using fluorescent light bulbs, such as Pink Out of a Corner to Jasper Johns of 1963. It's a very imprecise work, since you can't say for sure where it starts and ends. Instead, the light spills out into the space, even covering a viewer, who becomes, in a sense, part of the work too. It's reminiscent of the theatricality of George Siegel's cinema, whose light enveloped the viewer, you'll remember, and whose objects invaded the viewer's space. Clement Greenberg's protege, Michael Fried, criticized minimalism in a famous essay called Art and Objecthood from 1967. He said that instead of focusing on the intrinsic traits of sculpture, according to modernist ideals, minimalists created objects that related to people and their perceptions. This sort of interaction, he argued, was for theater to do, not for sculpture. So he condemned minimalism for misunderstanding its formal genre, sculpture.